Hello, I'm Dr. Bill Osmondson. I'm a general and cosmetic dentist and have been a dentist for 30 years. Before that, I received a master's in public health in nutrition and health education. For the first 25 years of practice, I promoted water fluoridation aggressively. I thought I saw the benefits. It wasn't until I actually looked at the information myself and sat down and looked at the different government agencies and the different reports and the studies that I began to realize that fluoridation was a problem. One of the first things I did is I looked at my tube of toothpaste. It says drug facts. I know it's a drug. If I were to give it to you, it'd have to be a prescription. That's for swallowing. When it comes to toothpaste, it also says don't swallow. And if you do swallow, contact a poison control center. Well, the amount of fluoride that they're talking about is a pea-sized amount of fluoride. You probably don't see that in advertisements, a pea-sized amount of fluoride. Usually when I see an advertisement, it looks more like a Dairy Queen ice cream cone. That amount is a 1/4 milligram of fluoride. Well, that's the same amount of fluoride as what we find in 8 ounces of water. 1/4 milligram of fluoride, 1/4 milligram of fluoride. Don't swallow. If you do, call the Poison Control Center. One of the things that concerns me is water fluoridation for infants. The American Dental Association and Center for Disease Control recommend that infants not receive water for drinking nor for making their formula. It's 250 times more concentrated in fluoride than mother's milk. We shouldn't fluoridate water and harm our most vulnerable. The next thing I looked at was dental fluorosis. These are the white and brown spots on the teeth. The only thing that causes dental fluorosis is fluoride. Too much fluoride ingested, usually during the developing years, birth to about 8 years of age. When I see people coming in to have treatment for dental fluorosis, I mention to them that they have had too much fluoride. And this is an indication that the rest of their body has probably had too much fluoride also, their bones and in the rest of their organs. Damage from dental fluorosis is not disputed. Everyone agrees that too much fluoride can cause dental fluorosis. About 1/3 of children are now experiencing fluorosis, according to the CDC. The next thing I wanted to look at was benefits. What are the benefits of it? I've heard reports of 20 to 40%, 60%, 80% tooth reduction with water fluoridation. So what is the benefit of water fluoridation? And I had a close look at several factors. One, comparing different countries of the world, we can see that no matter what we do on fluoridation, whether the country fluoridates or no fluoride at all, decay is reduced the same amount in all countries. We can compare states in the United States. We can see on a graph that as they're plotted in order of increased amount of fluoridation in the state, fluoridation doesn't make any difference. We have the same amount of good health in the states regardless of their fluoridation. Same thing for counties and other locations. That was disturbing to me. If there's no benefit, well, why are we fluoridating? I have 2 requests for you. One is to talk to your dentist and your healthcare provider about fluoridation. Ask them if they've seen the National Academy of Science report on fluoridation. Give them information that they may not have on water fluoridation and excess fluoride exposure. That helped me when my patients casually, calmly, quietly said, have a look at this. This doctor, this dentist is concerned about water fluoridation. What do you think? None of us professionals want to harm our patients. Our whole lives are given to improving the health of people, not harming them. And so for those of you who are healthcare professionals, I'd highly urge you to look once again at the science on fluoridation. Science doesn't need to be scary. It's just information. Spend a little bit of time looking at it on both sides of the issues. Don't just look at one side filtered. Look at both sides and weigh it for yourself. The other thing is to sign an online petition with me at fluoridealert.org. The online petition requests Congress to have hearings on fluoridation. It also recommends that we no longer fluoridate our water. Thank you.
You know, I had always believed that water fluoridation was a good thing. I mean, I had spent a lot of time in a dental chair as a kid, not from cavities, but from seemingly every other oral surgery you could imagine. And, you know, growing up, it was just from a, you know, I took science classes. I had a BS in ecology and a BA environmental science in college. And, you know, everything I had heard about and my exposure was that water fluoridation was a good thing. I can't say I read any scientific studies about it. I didn't really know the details, but I certainly knew that overwhelmingly the medical community and the dental community thought water fluoridation was a good thing. I remember debating some other environmental studies majors in college over the benefits of fluoridation. And, you know, to me, it was really a social justice thing. It was like for low-income kids who didn't have access to good dental care, it seemed like it made sense. When I first got asked by a client, when I was an environmental attorney, I had a client ask me to look at what would the environmental effects of fluoride be on salmon if a community on the Columbia River decided to fluoridate their drinking water. And, you know, my first joke was, well, I know what the effects would be. It would probably give the salmon much better teeth. And, you know, after actually making it clear to my client I wasn't interested, my client just said, hey, look, take a look into it. If you don't find anything, then we leave it alone. And what it really just took was one phone call to a fish biologist who said, don't worry about the arsenic, don't worry about the other heavy metals, some of the other toxics on the Columbia. The only toxic that's ever been proven to actually slow down and just about stop a salmon run on the Columbia River was fluoride. And at that point it was really a wake-up call. I said, you got to be kidding. And what I proceeded to learn, and it was really my entry into finally getting into the science, understanding what was the current state of science on this, was simply looking at the effects of fluoride on fish. And what I learned very quickly is that at about 1/4 of the concentration that we put fluoride at in drinking water, you can significantly affect salmon migration. They notice it being added to the water, and they'll actively avoid swimming into an area that has as low as 0.21 parts per million of fluoride. To me, it was an eye-opener. It was basically a pretty good sign that I didn't know a lot about fluoride other than the kind of common, what I would say, myths, which were that it was great for poor kids' teeth, that there weren't any adverse effects, and that anybody who raised concerns about fluoride was just a quack or somebody who didn't have science on their side. And I had to reevaluate a lot of things, and in the process I was just shocked at what I found. The new science that has come out about the impacts of fluoride and water fluoridation specifically in just the last several years, it exceeds almost anything. I mean, I work with toxics all day long, and we constantly have new information coming out about different emerging contaminants and endocrine disruptors and things like that. But in terms of the significance of what we've been finding, few things rival the new information that we found out about fluoride. Having the National Academy of Science come out and do a report that lays out the potential connections between water fluoridation and everything from Alzheimer's, increased risk of certain cancers, to impacts on neurological health of kids. That science is very compelling. For most people, when they learn that even the American Dental Association now warns against using fluoridated water to mix infant formula for kids, that's surprising to them. When you learn that the source of fluoride is coming out of, is a waste byproduct of phosphate fertilizer plants, that is a red flag to most people who care about clean water. I think that's a way to break through with people. I mean, I know it has. When we started with the Oregon legislature, talking to basically the medical professionals within the Oregon legislature and giving them this information, by the time they had reviewed it and considered it, we had the only doctor in the Oregon Senate, the only nurse in the Oregon Senate, and the only dentist in the Oregon legislature, all opposed to the water fluoridation bill. And it was based on just the science. I find very few people who actually, with an open mind, read through the science, understand the significance of the questions and what the direction that all the new science is pointing in terms of the risks of fluoride, who still go on to say we ought to force it into everybody's drinking water. Even for people who think that fluoride needs to be a part of some dental protection strategy, that there are other ways to deliver that outside the drinking water system.
My name is Vivian Howard. I'm the Professor of Bioimaging here at the University of Ulster in Coleraine, and I'm a medical pathologist and toxicologist, and my research over the past 20 or 30 years has involved looking at the effect of toxic substances on development in the fetus and the infant. This is generally recognized as an area of, or a period of life when you're especially vulnerable to certain effects. I guess the thing that got me interested in fluoride in the first place was the very, very low levels that you find in human breast milk. What that tells me is that throughout evolution we've built up a special mechanism for keeping fluoride away from the developing infant. Nature has devised a system for keeping fluoride away from the infant, and we're circumventing that by putting fluoride into drinking water. And I think there are consequences. So the question is, why is it that nature has devolved a system which specifically keeps fluoride away from the infant? And the answer is, it's a developmental toxin. And in particular, it's a neurotoxin. I mean, there's lots of epidemiological evidence now that, for example, it might affect the intelligence of the child, coming out of China, and that's been reviewed by the National Academy of Sciences. They say that you can't be absolutely certain about it, but there's quite a strong indication, and we need further research. There have also been other studies which show that it might be able to affect hormonal systems, endocrine systems, in particular thyroid levels, and that can have an effect on IQ in developing children. If you take the normal range of thyroid in the mother, then there's a difference in intelligence of the offspring between the mothers who have the upper limit of normal range and the lower limit of the normal range of thyroid hormone. So, you know, we're tinkering with quite a sensitive system. So the evidence is out there for us to have to say that we've got to be very careful. And my opinion is that there isn't a satisfactory one-dose-fits-all solution through treating a whole population via tap water. There are going to be some members of that population which will be more at disadvantage than others, and they will obviously include the fetus and the infant, but at the other end of life, people who've got marginal kidney function will be more susceptible. And therefore, I don't think, on a precautionary basis, that we should be continuing the fluoridation of drinking water supplies. If governments don't have ways of making sure that people in the areas that are fluoridated who are susceptible, like bottle-fed babies, are actually stopped from being exposed in that way, then they have no right, really, to be using a mass medication like this.
As a result of fluoridation, our children will be healthier and happier.
There is no health hazard that justifies postponing water fluoridation.
You're not dealing with a benign substance.
There's much too much risk for too little benefit.
Fluoride is safe.
They decided far too early, before the science was properly in, that fluoridation was a good thing.
The dental community has no idea of the toxicology behind fluoride.
Fluoride does not just affect the teeth.
Fluoride is a neurotoxin.
This is being drank by so many people throughout the U.S. every day.
But who's responsible? Who's the doctor making sure we're not getting too much?
The weight of evidence actually is more in favor of fluoride doing damage than against.
This is against all principles of modern pharmacology. It's really obsolete.
Water fluoridation is the practice of adding fluoride compounds to the public water supplies for the purpose of reducing tooth decay. The policy, which began in the United States in the 1940s, has been hailed by the Oral Health Division of the United States Centers for Disease Control as one of the top 10 public health achievements of the 20th century. However, a growing body of science indicates that fluoridation is neither safe nor effective. In this video, we examine why over 2,000 health, scientific, medical, dental, and environmental professionals are calling for an end to fluoridation worldwide.
Water fluoridation is the dispensing of a drug.
This is a way of delivering a medicine.
Fluoride is a drug, is a medicine.
Fluoride is being put in specifically to alter you physically, to make a physical change in you.
This is not chlorine. This is not any number of the other chemicals that are used to treat the water, make the water safe and drinkable.
It's not like chlorine used to make the water supply safe and kill the bugs in the water supply.
This is the only thing anywhere in the world that gets added to the municipal drinking waters to actually treat the human, to treat the body.
There is absolutely no drug on the market that's given in a one-dose-fits-all situation.
It's absolutely obsolete. It's in modern pharmacology, it's so clear that even if you have a fixed dose of a drug, the individuals respond very differently to one and the same dose. Now in this case, you have it in the water and people are drinking different amounts of water, so you have huge variations in the consumption.
You can have an athlete, a laborer, who are drinking many, many times the amount of water. You can have someone who's diabetic, who's drinking a ton of water compared to the average.
I mean, the whole name of the game in pharmacology is to deliver the right dose to the right person at the right time. And that's not what fluoridation does. It can't do it.
I would prefer an individual use approach. I would have no problem with a doctor or dentist prescribing fluoride for a patient that he was keeping in touch with and monitoring for possible side effects and for the efficacy of the drug. That's essentially what's done with any other drug, and that's the way it should be done for fluoride. We don't put other things in the water to try to keep everybody's blood pressure down or everybody's stroke risk down, and there's no reason why we should be trying a one-size-fits-all approach for this either.
The problem with adding medicine to water is an obvious one of consent, that people can't give their informed consent, which is a basic of medical ethics.
We're allowing communities to do to everybody in the community what an individual doctor cannot do to an individual patient, and that is prescribe medication regardless of the informed consent of the patient.
What physician that you know in his right mind would treat somebody whose medical history he doesn't know, who he's never met, with a substance that's meant to do change in their bodies, and just with the advice, have as much or as little of it as you like, but you'll take it for a lifetime because it's meant to help somebody else's teeth?
Voters medicate each other whether they want it or not. And if 51% of the voters say, we're going to medicate everybody in town, and they all get medicated.
Fluoride is not an essential element.
There's not a bodily requirement for fluoride.
Fluoride is not an essential nutrient, certainly as far as the UK goes. You look it up in the books to see what our Department of Health says, and they say that no essential use has been found for fluoride in the human body. So it is not in the category of a vitamin, and apart from anything, it's miles more toxic than any other vitamins.
Whatever benefit there is from fluoride on teeth is topical rather than systemic.
It's been shown that it's really a topical effect principally rather than a systemic effect.
It's effective topically, not when it's swallowed.
There's no reason for people be exposing themselves, all their internal organs, to fluoride when, if it works, you can do something topically.
If you want to prevent sunburn, you don't drink suntan lotion, you put it on your skin. And so if you want to have the benefits of fluoride in oral health, what you do is put it on the surface of the tooth and not drink it.
The quality of evidence for topical fluoride is in a different league from the evidence on water fluoridation. I mean, absolutely no question about that.
Adding fluoride to toothpaste, you are going to ingest some of it, and that needs to be taken seriously. But it's not made to be ingested, and it's made to be rubbed onto the surface of the tooth, which is where you're supposed to have it. It's a much smarter way to go about using fluoride in dentistry.
It's widely accepted that the topical application of fluoride to the surface of teeth is beneficial. I have no dispute with that. However, I can see absolutely no justification for asking the whole population to take it systemically, to swallow it, internalize it, for that benefit, because it's available in toothpastes, it's available in dental treatments at the dentist. So I don't think you can justify the fluoridation of drinking water on the lines of a topical treatment to teeth. It's illogical.
One of the recommendations I've made is because we now know that it doesn't need to be swallowed, that the public has to be informed. Again, informed consent. They should be told that it doesn't work by swallowing it.
One of the things that the proponents are very careful to stay away from is to mention how many people don't fluoridate.
Most of the Western world does not fluoridate their water. We are definitely in the minority in the fact that we push water fluoridation.
Many of the countries in the world, the developed countries, no longer fluoridate, never did fluoridate.
Most European countries do not fluoridate. Austria, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Germany, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, Italy, Greece, Portugal. The overwhelming number of countries in the world do not fluoridate, and guess what? Their teeth are just as good, if not better, than ours.
One of the most striking things, I suppose, was to look at trends in tooth decay over time in various countries.
The comparisons between fluoridated countries like America and unfluoridated ones like most of Europe, and indeed most of the world, are very interesting.
If you look at the World Health Organization database for 12-year-olds, that tooth decay has been coming down as rapidly in these non-fluoridated European countries as it's been coming down in the United States and other fluoridated communities.
Areas that don't fluoridate have seen the same decrease in tooth decay that we have seen over the same time span.
If you ask someone to pick out the lines, the decline lines, which are in countries where water is fluoridated, from those in countries where it isn't fluoridated, actually you can't pick them out. So I found that very surprising against the background of, as I say, having been a default fluoridationist.
What you really need to look at and what matters at the end is what's your total body load.
Children are getting a lot of fluoride from a lot of different sources.
We've had a tremendous increase in fluoride from many sources. Water is one source. When we drink that water, when it's made into soda pop or it's made into beverages and made into soups, made into other products, we get fluoride from that source also.
And we also have a lot of pesticides that have come on the market that leave fluoride residues on fruits and vegetables.
Fluoride is a very common component in pesticides. And so, if you drink a glass of grape juice that's a non-organic grape juice and it's got skins on it, you're going to get a very high level of fluoride just from your grape juice.
And they're also getting it from toothpaste. Studies have shown that you swallow quite a bit of toothpaste, or the children swallow quite a bit of toothpaste. Even if they're told not to swallow it, it just happens by accident. They don't rinse as well as adults, and sometimes they don't have as good swallowing actions. And therefore they're getting a lot of fluoride from that.
So who's monitoring this exposure of when are we getting too much? No one's monitoring that. Nobody's looking at the total exposure to ensure that we're not getting too much and that certain subgroups aren't getting too much.
The reality is we need to reduce our fluoride intake.
In 2005, the Center for Disease Control admitted that 32% of our children in the United States, including children in non-fluoridated areas, have dental fluorosis.
About a third of the children in this country have some form of dental fluorosis, meaning that they had too much fluoride exposure during their early childhood.
Dental fluorosis is damage to the tooth because of too much fluoride exposure. We swallowed too much fluoride, and it shows up as white spots, brown spots on the teeth.
You see these white spots or splotches or lines. In more severe fluorosis, you actually see the surface layer flaking off. You see brown spots.
And in severe cases, there's actual chipping and pitting and erosion of the tooth.
Dental fluorosis is a biomarker that your child has been overexposed to fluoride during the development of their teeth.
We now believe that there are several mechanisms involved. Fluoride could be inhibiting the enzymes, the serine proteinases that are degrading the final traces of proteins that are left behind in the teeth.
The mechanisms have something to do with interference with the enamel-forming proteins or inhibition of some enzymes during that critical period.
To do that, impacting those the enamel cells in the teeth means that it can also impact cells elsewhere in the body.
The promoters have always had this faith that you could damage the growing tooth enamel, the enzymes, the G proteins, or however that happens, without damaging any other tissue in the body at the same time. And I think that's very unlikely.
Not only is it an effect on teeth, what's happening in the teeth is very likely happening in the bone as well, because we have the similar kind of structure of hydroxyapatite mineral structure in the bone and the tooth.
Your teeth are sort of a window into the bone, a window into your skeleton.
So if there's this adverse effects going on in the teeth, there are very likely to be adverse effects going on in the bone.
It's a sign of toxicity. It is not just to be dismissed as merely a cosmetic effect.
This whole debate has been captured for over 50 years by the dental lobby, by dentists whose preoccupation is teeth. Well, teeth are not the only issue in the body.
As dentists, we diagnose pathology of the mouth, diseases of the mouth. And we tend to disregard or not involve ourselves with the diseases of the rest of the body because it's not within our purview, it's not within our license to diagnose other parts of the body.
Most definitely, the dental community has had a monopoly, if you will, on the study of fluoride. And they have absolutely used tunnel vision to look at fluoride as a dental concern. However, it is not just a dental concern. It's a toxicity concern.
The National Research Council has a report that just came out in 2006, which is one of the best sources of finding out what fluoride is doing to the rest of the body.
One of the most interesting things in the report is the diversity of the number of organs that are being affected by the fluoride beyond either the teeth or the bones.
We do need to get away from looking only at fluoride in connection with teeth. We need to be considering its effect on a whole bunch of other systems in the body, on people's general health in a whole lot of respects.
I think the ADA's recent statement on warning against adding fluoridated water to baby formula is a watershed decision.
The American Dental Association has finally done what it should have done years ago, and that is to tell parents not to use fluoridated tap water to make up formula.
The American Dental Association recommends that we not have fluoridated water be used for making infant formula or for infants to drink.
One of the messages which I think is extraordinary in this whole issue is that the level of fluoride in mother's milk is so extremely low. It's 0.004 parts per million, which is 250 times less than we put in the drinking water.
There have been a couple men who have said, well, maybe mother's milk is flawed, but most scientists don't go that route. They say mother's milk seems to be the best we have, the best we know of, and if it's low in fluoride, maybe that's what we should have for infants, is low fluoride.
Nature has devised a system for keeping fluoride away from the infant, and we're circumventing that by putting fluoride into drinking water. And I think there are consequences.
I think parents should know that fluoride is an extremely active chemical when it gets into our body. It can interfere with the pineal gland. It can interfere with the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland and the pineal gland are both intimately involved with brain development, mental development.
A real concern with young kids, especially with newborn infants, is that the blood-brain barrier is not fully developed at that point, and when children are drinking a formula made with fluoridated drinking water, they're getting a huge an inappropriate dose of fluoride in the developing brain. This may be part of the reason, for instance, of the depression of IQ that we've seen in these Chinese studies.
You do not want to create a fluoride exposure during a period of brain vulnerability.
All of these things are indicators, serious indicators, that you shouldn't expose young babies to fluoride. And of course that's exactly what happens when you put fluoride in the water.
How are low-income kids supposed to, or low-income families, supposed to avoid giving their kids fluoridated water?
They can't afford to avoid it. They can't afford to seek sources of drinking water that has no fluoride in it.
I think that the low-income communities could be at higher risk for adverse effects from fluoride exposure or from water fluoridation.
As far as I can see, there is no doubt that the intake of fluoridated water is going to interrupt basic functions of nerve cells in the brain.
The NRC committee did review the available information on fluoride effects on the brain, on neurological function, and we concluded that there does seem to be evidence for some effects. There needs to be more study of several areas. There certainly seem to be effects on the developing brain, but there may also be effects on the brain in older individuals as well.
The research on the brain since our study was published has absolutely confirmed what we predicted and what we reported in 1995.
There are now 30 animal studies which indicate that fluoride could damage the brain. And this comes on top of a number of studies from China which indicates that fluoride lowers IQ in children.
I mean, there's lots of epidemiological evidence now that, for example, it might affect the intelligence of the child coming out of China, and that's been reviewed by the National Academy of Sciences. They say that you can't be absolutely certain about it, but there's quite a strong indication, and we need further research.
In my view, fluoride today, as far as intelligence and the brain is concerned, is where lead was in the early 70s. In the early 70s, scientists knew that high levels of lead could cause brain damage in children and other health effects, but they felt that subclinical levels of lead were okay. I think the same thing is happening now with fluoride, that it's only a function of getting more and more sensitive tests to show that even lower levels of fluoride can cause lowering of IQ and other subtle effects.
You know, while these bits of further research are going on to elucidate what the absolute truth is, we should be taking a more precautionary stance and saying, okay, for the time being, we don't fluoridate.
concern about fluoride and the effect on the thyroid is multifold.
Fluoride was used to suppress hyperactive thyroid, especially in Europe back in the 40s and 50s. And the doses that were used to suppress thyroid activity are now in the range that people are getting in the U.S. from this vast overexposure to fluoride.
There's a consistent body of literature that indicates that fluoride exposure does reduce thyroid function in humans and in experimental animals, and that the exposures in humans associated with these effects are in the range of exposures that are expected with people who drink fluoridated water.
A large percentage of the population of the United States does have some problem with the thyroid gland.
The large number of people who have hypothyroid, underactive thyroid now, may very well be related to the fact that there's so much fluoride in the environment.
The ingestion of fluoride does affect the actions of the thyroid gland.
A hypothyroid individual should definitely be concerned about drinking fluoridated water because it would take a very serious clinical condition and it could make it even worse.
The effects of hypothyroidism, even probably borderline hypothyroidism, are things like depression, lethargy. When a person just doesn't feel like getting up and doing anything, there are obviously a lot of things that can cause that, but low thyroid function is among them, and low thyroid function is a contributor to depression in some, perhaps many people.
We have several studies, as a matter of fact, in the United States that have shown that fluoride can increase bone fracture rates.
Peer-reviewed studies in prestigious journals such as the Journal of the American Medical Association that's showing increased risk of bone fracture based on the amount of fluoride that a person consumes. And consuming it in the level that people get from drinking fluoridated drinking water.
We do know from animal studies that the strength of the bone actually starts to decline the more fluoride you have in the bone. The fluoride makes the bone more brittle.
Sufficient accumulation of fluoride in the bones seems to make them weaker. It makes them more dense on X-ray film, but this is associated with a more brittle structure.
Of course, we're concerned about hip fractures because that's a huge cost to the healthcare system.
Hip fracture in the elderly, in all too many cases, means that that person is not going to walk again or will even die.
It's well known in the endemic fluorosis areas that the first sign of skeletal fluorosis is aching joints.
The early stages of skeletal fluorosis are associated with bone and joint pain.
Fluoride causes symptoms identical to arthritis.
You cannot distinguish the fluorosis or early fluoride poisoning from rheumatoid or osteoarthritis. It's very much the same.
Nobody, to my knowledge, has yet looked carefully at fluoridated cities or fluoridated populations and looked at the symptoms of arthritis to determine whether or not fluoride is contributing to this endemic or possibly epidemic of arthritis that we have in North America.
I think there's every reason to be concerned that today fluoride is one of the factors contributing to the epidemic of arthritis in this country. According to the CDC, 1 in 3 American adults have some form of arthritis. That's 68 million Americans.
Supposedly the fluoride exposures in this country are not usually high enough to get to skeletal fluorosis, but again, that's an area that really has not been studied well. I think it's likely, it's not a given, but I think it's likely that a lot of early stage skeletal fluorosis does show up as bone and joint pain, but it's never recognized as being skeletal fluorosis.
If I was an arthritic individual, I would be eliminating every possible source of fluoride exposure that I could think of.
If you ask most dentists and ask them what they're putting in the water, most dentists would say sodium fluoride, pharmaceutical sodium fluoride, the same stuff that is in toothpaste.
They have absolutely no idea that it's, in 9 out of 10 cases, hydrofluorosilicic acid, and that hydrofluorosilicic acid is a waste product for the phosphate industry.
This has come about because for maybe 100 years, the phosphate fertilizer industry put out two very, very poisonous gases into the environment, hydrogen fluoride and silicon tetrafluoride. Eventually, they were required to capture those, and they did it with a wet spray, water, and that water converts these two very toxic gases into hexafluorosilicic acid. And it's this scrubbing liquor, which is about 25% strong, is put into tanker trucks, driven around the country, and added to our drinking water.
If this stuff goes out the stack, it's an air pollutant. If it goes directly into the water supply, if they would take that scrubber liquor and dump it into the local river, it's a water pollutant. But if they put it into a tank wagon and sell it to somebody, a water authority, like magic, it's not a pollutant. And they can take that then to your drinking water supply and not discharge it into your river. They just charge it directly into your drinking water supply, slowly bleed it in, and as magic, it's no longer a toxic pollutant. It's now what's called a product.
It's never purified. It's not a pharmaceutical grade compound. It's a mixture of whatever that collects in the stack gases. And it contains lots of contaminants, a lot of heavy metals.
When you're talking about adding fluoride to drinking water, you're not just talking about adding fluoridation chemicals. You're talking about adding all of the industrial waste byproducts that come along with it. In Oregon, where we've got 135 communities that already exceed the drinking water standards for arsenic, the idea of adding any more arsenic to drinking water, even if it's a small amount, just doesn't make a lot of sense. I find very few people who actually, with an open mind, read through the science, understand the significance of the questions and what the direction that all the new science is pointing in terms of the risks of fluoride, who still go on to say we ought to force it into everybody's drinking water.
We have better ways of improving dental health today than using fluoridation. And let's be sensible about it.
It doesn't work systemically. It works topically.
It is unethical. It is unnecessary. It's ineffective. It's dangerous.
I mean, this is so obvious. It's so really very, very far-fetched. You have the teeth there. They are available for you. Why drink the stuff?
In April of 1999, one of Canada's leading dental researchers began calling for an end to water fluoridation. That researcher was Dr. Hardy Lineback, president of the Canadian Association of Dental Research and head of preventive dentistry at the University of Toronto.
And I guess I'm here in Mississauga because here we have in yourself a practicing dentist, an expert advisor to the Canadian Dental Association, and president of the Canadian Association for Dental Research, and the chairman, head of the Department of Preventive Dentistry at Toronto. But about a year ago, the name made headlines in Canada and beyond when you came out and said you were opposed to fluoridation. What led up to that?
Basically, it started in 1992 when I helped a colleague of mine, Chris Clark, who's a public health dentist at University of British Columbia. Together we organized a workshop to look at the issue of whether or not fluoride supplements should be banned for children who are susceptible for dental fluorosis.
What is a supplement? What's a fluoride?
Fluoride supplement is a tablet of fluoride that gives you the equivalent of a daily dose of fluoridated water. It's a dose that we had always assumed was necessary to protect kids in non-fluoridated areas.
So this would be a tablet that they would swallow?
Yes, or chew and swallow.
Chew and swallow, yeah. And what was your conclusion about the benefit of those supplements?
At the end of the conference, we had experts from all over the States and Canada come together. We came up with a new schedule saying basically, let's ban fluoride supplements for kids under the age of 3 because it was causing dental fluorosis. And it wasn't providing that much of a benefit at all.
Now, what was it then that took you from opposing supplements before the age of 3 to opposing having fluoride in the drinking water?
A number of events occurred. First, I was asked to reorganize another convention or conference on fluoride supplements because the organizations couldn't agree. So we convened again after 5 years in 1997. I invited a number of experts from all over the world, and we had a new conference on fluoride supplements. And during that time I reviewed the literature as well and discovered that there really wasn't any evidence that fluoride swallowing does any good. In other words, systemic fluoride has very little to do with protecting teeth. It's the contact of the fluoride with the teeth after they appear in the oral cavity, after they erupt, that provides the benefit. And that's when I decided that, wait a minute, we're now using fluoridated water as a drug. We're ingesting it. It really should be used as a mouthwash. We shouldn't be using it to swallow and expose our kids to systemic fluoride.
Now, how many dental researchers around the world agree with you that the benefits of fluoride come from applying the fluoride directly to the tooth rather than through the whole body?
I would say the majority of dental researchers who are knowledgeable about fluoride, karyology, the mechanisms of how fluoride prevents dental decay, the majority would agree that it's a topical effect.
Well, tell us more about industrial grade fluoride being used for the water supply. Tell us more about that.
Well, I had always assumed that the fluoride that we're using to fluoridate the water supply was pharmaceutical grade sodium fluoride. Then I found out that the majority of the fluoride that's used in fluoridating water supplies in Canada, I got a federal government document documenting it. The majority of it is sodium or hydrofluorosilicylic acid or sodium silicates, fluorosilicates, and these are added to the water supply to produce 1 part per million fluoride in the water. They dilute this stuff down to 1 part per million. Apparently this dilutes all the contaminants that are in there down to levels that are allowed by the EPA. George Glasser showed me a list of all the contaminants in one of the articles he wrote, and I could not believe that we were actually dumping lead and arsenic and even radium, which is produced in the process of making this pollutant. From what I understand, the pollutant is recovered from the smokestack scrubbers in the phosphate fertilizer industry, and it's very rich in fluoride, very toxic. But of course, when you dilute it into the water supply, it goes down to 1 part per million, and supposedly is quite safe. My concern is that we're building up the contaminants in our system. We know that lead accumulates in soft tissues, the brain and bone. We know that actually lead accumulating in teeth make the teeth more susceptible to dental decay. My concern is also the radium contaminants that are found in hydrofluorosilicylic acid. This is known now from the phosphate fertilizer industry that when you make phosphate fertilizer, you release some of the radium from the earth, and this now gets recovered in this industrial grade fluoride that they recover from the smokestacks. They're putting this stuff in our water. And then I found an article saying that radium is the source, or one of the main reasons why we have osteosarcoma in Canadian children, an article written by Finkelstein showing the connection between radium in the water and osteosarcoma in children.
How many dentists in Canada do you think are aware that this material, this fluoride that is put into the drinking water, actually is this industrial hazardous waste? Do you think most of them are aware or unaware?
Most. If the only person teaching preventive dentistry didn't know about it, do you think anybody else would know? No, I don't think even a single dentist knew until it started becoming more of an open issue because of the anti-fluoridationists.
When you talk to other dentists and they hear about this being an industrial waste product, does it faze them at all? Or what's the reaction?
The first reaction is prove it.
Yeah. They don't believe it.
They don't believe it.
No. What is dental fluorosis and what causes it?
Dental fluorosis is simply the malformation of dental enamel. And actually, dental fluorosis has affected not only the enamel but also the dentin. The dentin is the inside layer of the tooth. The surface layer is the enamel, and that's what we see. We see white spots on kids' teeth, and that's what we call dental fluorosis. The way it forms basically is that the fluoride interferes with the development of the tooth. I did 10 years worth of research in my laboratory studying tooth development, so I know how teeth develop. And Pamden Beston and a few others have been looking at the effects of fluoride on tooth development. And we now believe that there are several mechanisms involved. Fluoride could be inhibiting the enzymes, the serine proteinases that are degrading the final traces of proteins that are left behind in the teeth. The proteins, if they're left behind on the surface of the enamel, will take up space, and it won't allow the crystals to grow to this beautiful shiny luster that you see normal enamel presents itself. You see these white spots or splotches or lines. In more severe fluorosis, you actually see the surface layer flaking off. You see brown spots, the classical Colorado brown stain. We're now seeing that in North America in fluorosis area, in areas of fluoridated cities where kids are adding to the fluoride exposure with toothpaste. We're actually getting brown stain, the Colorado brown stain, in healthy kids. Now, it may not be a big concern to them, but the current concern I have, obviously, is that they've got too much fluoride in their system anyway.
Well, that's actually my next question, because certainly in America, the various government agencies now dismiss dental fluorosis as a cosmetic effect, that it's, polish it off or do something with it, and it hasn't done any harm to the person. Could you address that question? Is it just a cosmetic effect? Should we be concerned about dental fluorosis for other reasons?
Well, number one, simply a cosmetic effect is a brush off. What basically they're saying is that we're willing to accept a certain amount of cosmetic problems to prevent decay. Well, if the fluoridation isn't preventing decay anymore, and there's now plenty of evidence in the last 5 years that it's not preventing decay anymore, then the fluorosis that's being produced is now being treated for many different, in many different ways. It's being treated by surface polishing, by bleaching, by porcelain veneers. If you actually estimate how much work is being done on kids with dental fluorosis, we're treating way more teeth for the problem of dental fluorosis than we would treat if there was a marginal increase in dental decay from taking fluoride out of the water. Most of the studies now show that the fluoridated cities have twice the incidence of dental fluorosis, and yet the decay rate is no different. Number two is that the fluoride is accumulating in these people, and I've got lots of evidence to show you that even if you stop the fluoride exposure at a very early age, the kids still get fluorosis in their back teeth because the bone is loaded with fluoride. Their system develops or picks up so much fluoride from the overexposure from the water and the toothpaste and other sources from the diet that the bone has too much fluoride. The bone is the source of the fluoride that causes the dental fluorosis. Now, because they have so much fluoride in the bone, we have more concerns about tooth development, delayed tooth eruption, malocclusion, possible bone fracture, premature skeletal development or maturation. There are many concerns now that are appearing from research that fluoride in kids in their bone system is not good. Add to that the risk for osteosarcoma.
Explain what osteosarcoma is.
Bone cancer. Now, I have a serious concern about bone cancer. We're starting to see some publications now that links fluoridated cities with bone cancer. There may be a number of explanations for this. We now know that fluoride reduces testosterone. There may be a connection between this lowering of testosterone and osteosarcoma in young males. I have a concern because nobody has yet measured the amount of fluoride that the bone cells are exposed to when they're turning bone over. If kids have higher fluoride levels in their bone, and their bone cells are exposed to those higher fluoride levels, we know from in vitro studies in test tubes and in culture, that fluoride at higher concentrations are cytotoxic, that they cause damage, they can cause cancer, they can cause, these higher levels can cause all kinds of damage to the cell. So these bone cells are being exposed to likely higher levels than normal. And nobody has yet measured right locally, right next to the cell, how much fluoride these cells are being exposed to.
Tell us about your study where you looked at the levels of fluoride in the bones of Montreal people and the bones of people in Toronto. Explain where this study came from and what you found.
I got interested in the fluoride accumulation in bone, and that's one of the reasons I was concerned about water fluoridation. When I discovered that you didn't need to swallow fluoride to make it work to prevent dental decay, I was concerned that people were accumulating fluoride in bone, in kids and elderly patients. At the time that all of these epidemiological studies were being published, where there's an increased risk for hip fractures. Danielson studies, Jacobs studies, these were studies that were starting to raise some concern in the medical community that perhaps fluoride could be causing some harm, some increased risk for bone fracture. So we set out to actually prove that 1 part per million wasn't really that detrimental, that it wasn't affecting the bones the way that some of these studies were suggesting. And that's how we actually got funded. We set out to prove that it was safe. Whether or not that's why we got funded, I mean, that's irrelevant. But the way we designed the experiment was simply to collect hip bones from people that were donating their hips during total hip implant surgery, compare the bone samples that we retrieved from people in Montreal, where Montreal is not fluoridated, never has been fluoridated. Compare that to the Torontonians, Mount Sinai Hospital. We now have compared about 60 samples. It turns out that the Montreal bone samples have a very small variation in terms of their fluoride content and hover around 200 parts per million. The variation in the Torontonian hip samples is tremendous. It varies from 200 up to 2,500 parts per million. We're now looking at just looking at one disease entity, osteoarthritis, factoring in all of the age effects, etc., and not even looking at Toronto versus Montreal, just simply looking at the fluoride content. Now we have done that. What we have done now is to look at the fluoride content in the same type of bone, and we've discovered actually, or Debbie, who is the PhD student, Debbie Chashra, has discovered that there's a direct correlation between the fluoride content and the architecture of the bone. In other words, fluoride just from water fluoridation exposure, because we presume that the Montrealers and Torontonians have had the same amount of toothpaste exposure. Because in Canada, fluoridated toothpaste was introduced in the same time. We now believe that the little bit of fluoride that's been incorporated into their bone has affected their architecture. Now, whether that's positive or negative, we haven't got enough data yet to show. And the abstracts that we've published so far at the international meetings basically report these findings, that there are differences between Toronto and Montreal, that we are seeing effect of fluoridated water on the architecture of the bone. Whether or not this makes the bone slightly stronger or slightly weaker, we don't know yet. We do know from animal studies that the strength of the bone actually starts to decline the more fluoride you have in the bone. The fluoride makes the bone more brittle because the crystals are packed tighter, and these crystals actually make the bone like a crystal, like a more easily fractured crystal, and therefore a bone that's rich in fluorapatite or fluoride will break more easily. It's more brittle.
And that would appear to be consistent with these 8 studies on hip fracture.
Yeah. Well, the increase in fluoride that these people in the States have been exposed to from just water fluoridation may have contributed to the brittleness of their bone. Because the longer you live, obviously, the more fluoride you accumulate into your bone. And if you build up enough fluoride in your bone from the fluoride in the water, you may end up with bone that's slightly more brittle than average. And of course, we're concerned about hip fractures because that's a huge cost to the healthcare system. You know, studies show that it's devastating to these people, especially the old ladies, mostly women that are affected by this, end up in wheelchairs, and some don't live through the ordeal. They end up in nursing homes. There's been a study now saying that women would rather die than have a hip fracture because of the prospect of being in a nursing home in a wheelchair afterwards. So this is a huge issue that we should be addressing, and we should be looking very carefully at what we're doing to our bodies, you know, everybody's body. So far, Torontonians have only been exposed for 30 or 35 years to fluoridated water. What's going to happen in 60 years? You know, we're seeing patients with 2,500 parts per million fluoride in their bone. You don't see that in Montreal. So what's going to happen 30 years from now when people are 70 years old with 60 years of fluoridated water exposure? If we continue to expose our population to the level of fluoride that they're exposed to now, there's no question in my mind that we're going to see bone problems, severe bone problems, further down the road, 30 years from now. No question about it.
What about this notion of things around the bone? I guess arthritis, the joints. What is this concern? Could fluoride be interfering with the materials around the bone?
It's well known in the endemic fluorosis areas that the first sign of skeletal fluorosis is aching joints. Fluoride deposits actually in the joints, in the soft parts of the joints, the tendons and the cartilage. And that fluoride deposition results in real achy joints. Nobody, to my knowledge, has yet looked carefully at fluoridated cities or fluoridated populations and looked at the symptoms of arthritis to determine whether or not fluoride is contributing to this endemic or possibly epidemic of arthritis that we have in North America.
Mm-hmm. Could you give us any other concerns that you have? We talked about teeth and we talked about bones. What about beyond bones?
I'm quite concerned because I'm now learning the chemistry behind fluoride mechanisms and its toxicology. And it's quite possible that fluoride, even at low levels, could affect essential mechanisms such as the cyclic AMP second messenger. Fluoride is a known activator of G protein. And we figure, or some people figure, that fluoride could be affecting all kinds of cellular metabolism through this G protein mechanism. I'm concerned about the effect of fluoride on thyroid tissue. I'm concerned about the effect of fluoride on a number of other tissues. We've learned now that it accumulates in the pineal gland, that it may be affecting melatonin production. I'm concerned about reproductive organs and its effect on reproductive organs. There's lots of animal studies to show that at higher doses it's devastating to the animal's reproductive systems. So, you know, there are some studies that are coming out now looking at human beings in, you know, fluoridated cities where there's been 30, 40, 50 years of water fluoridation. We should be doing studies. We should be carefully looking at the effects of fluoride level exposures and the soft tissue effects.
Well, how's the dental community responded to this latest research and the things that you've mentioned, the pineal gland and the G proteins and the other studies that you mentioned?
I can tell you that there's nothing in the literature that they would have read about the toxicology of fluoride. The journal Fluoride is not even in our dental library. I've now made sure, thanks to the generosity of the International Society for Fluoride Research, they're going to send us the journal back issues to put in our library. The dental community has no idea of the toxicology behind fluoride. The environmental issues is news to them. We really have to do our job to educate the dental community on the possible harmful effects of fluoride.
But we often get either dentists or representatives of the American Dental Association going in front of the public saying there is no debate, there is no scientific debate, there is no evidence of any harmful effects. Where are these statements coming from?
It's based on years and years of circular arguments. You know, when 30 years ago they decided to do reviews of the safety of fluoride, they didn't do the research, they didn't look for the harmful effects, therefore they didn't exist. The harmful effects that didn't exist. It's a circular argument. So they're ignoring more recent data that's coming up now with evidence that it may be harmful in even smaller doses that we had assumed. And they keep coming back to the basic argument that it's safe because we don't see any evidence of harm.
Just about nearly 2 years ago, I had the enormous pleasure to interview the late Dr. John Cahoon in New Zealand. And when we got to the topic of osteosarcoma, he said that he knew parents of children who died from osteosarcoma. And he said, he asked the rhetorical question, how many tooth surfaces saved could justify the loss of one child to osteosarcoma if indeed that was caused by fluoride. Let me ask you the same question. I mean, how many teeth saved would justify some of the health effects that we may be getting from fluoride?
Well, I think the health care system, the people responsible for the health care system should look at the total risk benefit and make a decision. If they actually start making estimates on the cost to the healthcare system, even if there is an underestimate of the hip fractures, if there's an underestimate of the bone cancers, if there's an underestimate of the hypothyroidism resulting from fluoride interference with iodine and thyroid function, an underestimation of the reproductive effects, if you even make those calculations and add that to the equation of dental fluorosis, it's quite clear that the benefits do not outweigh the risks. The risks are far too high. If I was to provide fluoride to a patient in this dental chair and not inform them about the risks involved in swallowing this fluoride, if they take this fluoride toothpaste home, now there's warning labels on the toothpaste, but if I give a special formulation to patients and I say, take this home and use it, it's going to prevent dental decay. If I don't provide warnings and discuss the precautions and the harmful side effects that might occur when you swallow this stuff, I could be sued in civil law, in a civil law court for not getting informed consent. Cities have never obtained informed consent from their residents after putting or before putting fluoride in the water supply.
Why is it difficult to get people, dentists, doctors and others, to even look at this issue?
I think because the national governmental organizations have publicly stated they want fluoride in the water to protect people from dental disease. You have to completely turn around 180 degrees organizations like the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, the American Dental Association, the National Institute for Dental and Craniofacial Research, the NIDCR, which is a institute from the National Institute of Health. The public health associations recommend fluoride in the water. Everybody still recommends fluoride in the water. We have to eat away at each and every single organization and convince them that they're in the wrong position, that it can no longer be supported, possibly even legally. If there's enough evidence of damage, we may be in a situation to encourage people to to speak out and use legal means to stop fluoridation, because if they're being damaged without informed consent, without providing informed consent, they have a good legal basis to start a class action lawsuit. Now, I don't want to take that approach. I think education is probably the best approach. But unless they change their minds in the next few years, based on the current evidence, I think it's time for litigation. One of the recommendations I've made is because we now know that it doesn't need to be swallowed, that the public has to be informed. Again, informed consent. They should be told that it doesn't work by swallowing it.
Fluoride science is corporate science. Fluoride science is DDT science. It's asbestos science. It's tobacco science. It's a racket.
In July of 2004, Christopher Bryson sat down and discussed the findings of his new book, The Fluoride Deception, with Paul Connett of the Fluoride Action Network. The Fluoride Deception was published by 7 Stories Press in May of 2004. The book is based on nearly 10 years of research by Bryson, an award-winning journalist and former producer at the BBC. In this interview, we asked Bryson to introduce us to some of the important individuals and institutions which have played a role in shaping public policy on the toxicity of fluoride and the purported safety of the controversial water fluoridation program.
In 1993, I was working at Rockefeller Center in New York as a radio producer for the BBC. And I got a call from London. There was a local water fluoridation battle in the north of England, in Leeds. And the producers, it was a daytime radio show. You and Yours was the name of the program. And the producer said, "Chris, what do you know about fluoride? What do the Yanks think about fluoride? Is there an American angle?" And it was a very, familiar request to me. Is there an American angle to the story? And I said, "Look, I don't know fluoride from a hole in the wall. I have no idea about fluoride, but let me make a few phone calls to see if I can't help you out." And my first call was to Ralph Nader in Washington. And I'm not sure why I called Ralph Nader, but look, it was a consumer issue. And Mr. Consumer, Ralph Nader, I thought, let's give him a call. And I got through, and he said, "Look, I don't know a great deal about water fluoridation, but I've never had terribly good feelings about it. Here are the names of a couple of scientists you ought to speak with." And he gave me the names of Dr. William Hersey, who then and now is a chemist at the Environmental Protection Agency, and Dr. Robert J. Carton. Bob Carton had been with EPA, but at that time was then over at the U.S. Army. And I went down to Washington and met with Dr. Hersey and Dr. Carton, and they explained to me that the safety standards for water fluoridation in this country are based on fraudulent science. Fluoride defenders will say there's 2 stories. There's the industrial story and there's the dental story, and ne'er the twain shall meet. It's not true. The stories are braided very tightly and very profoundly, and they're braided from the beginning. The very first suggestion that fluoride be added to public water supplies was made by a researcher, Gerald Cox, at the Mellon Institute in Pittsburgh. Cox became interested in fluoride because of the suggestion of Francis Frary. That's the letter I uncovered. Francis Frary is the director of the aluminum laboratory for the Aluminum Company of America. He is very concerned about fluoride pollution around aluminum plants. He's very concerned about what the fluoride is doing to the workers inside these aluminum plants. But his suggestion to Gerald Cox is to look at fluoride's dental effects. And it's upon the basis of that suggestion that Gerald Cox makes his proposal to add fluoride to public water supplies. Right at the very source of the stream, you find the aluminum industry. Cox's suggestion that we add fluoride to public water supplies needs to be understood for who was saying it and where he was saying it and what the track record of the Mellon Institute was. The Mellon Institute was a leading defender of asbestos for the asbestos industry. You know, today, industry are facing a tidal wave, a crippling tidal wave of lawsuits from people who have had their health damaged, who've been killed by asbestos. Well, for generations, the Mellon Institute produced research that said that mesothelioma was caused by something other than asbestos. That's how you have to understand the fluoride issue. Industry was concerned about fluoride pollution and about lawsuits of a similar magnitude for fluoride pollution. So it's no coincidence that the Mellon Institute makes the first suggestion that fluoride be added to public water supplies. It's quite astonishing, Paul, the degree to which environmentalists have not been educated about fluoride. You know, and I'm a reporter. I'm not a scientist or a doctor. You know, I'm quoting documents. I'm citing lawsuits when I refer to fluoride. Industrial air pollutants, in fact, the leading air pollutant in the aftermath of the Cold War. Those are not my words. That's not my opinion. That's a quantitative assessment by industry experts of the scale of the lawsuits they were facing. You know, the most notorious air pollution disaster in U.S. history was the Halloween air pollution incident in Donora, Pennsylvania, a mill town south of Pittsburgh, where a couple of dozen people and several thousand were injured because of effluents coming from a U.S. steel plant, which were trapped by a temperature inversion. In the aftermath of those deaths, a researcher, Philip Stadler, a chemist, Philip Stadler, investigated. He did blood analysis and he measured high levels of fluoride in the blood of some of the injured and the deceased. He published that data along with data which found high levels of fluoride in vegetation and a lot of other circumstantial evidence indicating fluoride poisoning. Sadler published his research in Chemical and Engineering News, but the Public Health Service came in and said that fluoride wasn't responsible. It was a mixture of air pollutants and bad weather that had caused the disaster. Well, I uncovered a memo, Paul, a memo from the Aluminum Company of America in which they had secretly gotten blood from one of the deceased, and their measurements were almost exactly the same measurements that Philip Stadler found. Laundering fluoride's role in the Donora pollution incident is really emblematic for what has happened for the last half century and an accounting for why environmentalists don't know their own history. Donora jump-started the environmental movement, but environmentalists don't know that Donora was almost certainly caused by fluoride. The book looks very hard at the role of a key scientist, Dr. Harold Hodge, in the fluoride debate. Dr. Harold Hodge, for most of the Cold War, was the leading scientific defender of the safety of low doses of fluoride and the beneficial effects of water fluoridation.
Dr. Harold Hodge, a distinguished toxicologist on the Rochester team, has carefully investigated the safety of fluoridation.
Well, to put it very simply, fluoride is safe at 1 part per million.
No scientist's word was trusted more by the health establishment than Dr. Harold Hodge when it came to fluoride. He was a very senior figure and operated at the highest levels for almost all his scientific career.
This brings us back to the fundamental point. Fluoride is safe, and I think I can say in conclusion that there is no health hazard that justifies postponing water fluoridation.
Harold Hodge, we now know, was the a co-orchestrator of the human radiation experiments in which citizens in hospitals at Rochester and in Oak Ridge were injected with plutonium by scientists under Harold Hodge's direction.
And there's a whole book written about that.
That's right. We know about Harold Hodge in part because of the work of investigative reporters such as Eileen Welsom, who won a Pulitzer Prize for discovering the names of the people who had been injected with plutonium. Harold Hodge's name surfaced in that book and surfaced in the subsequent presidential inquiry into the human radiation experiments. You join the dots. If Harold Hodge and the University of Rochester are injecting people with plutonium and uranium, and at the same time they are reassuring us about fluoride safety, what's the connection?
So what was the connection? Harold Hodge was the chief toxicologist of the Manhattan Project, the group of scientists and engineers who developed the atomic bomb in World War II and in the early years of the Cold War. Hodge was responsible for investigating the toxicity of many of the chemicals used in the production of the atomic bomb, and one of the chemicals of major concern was fluoride.
The Manhattan Project needed enormous quantities of fluoride to make nuclear weapons, to make the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. So the Manhattan Project were concerned about fluoride toxicity. The documents that I uncovered with Joel Griffiths in the files of the Manhattan Project and the Atomic Energy Commission are very clear and very explicit. The toxicology department at the University of Rochester, which was under the direction of Harold Hodge, was asked to come up with medical information that could help the government in lawsuits in which the United States Army and the US government were being charged with fluoride pollution.
As has now been revealed by declassified government documents, the publication of scientific information collected by Atomic Energy Commission scientists such as Harold Hodge that could increase the chance of litigation against the bomb program by workers or downwind communities was forbidden. If water fluoridation was found to be harmful, then the US bomb program, as well as many other fluoride polluting industries, would have been open to massive litigation.
So there's not a hope that Harold Hodge would ever say that water fluoridation was dangerous or that fluoride in small doses was toxic. Because if Harold Hodge were to say that, it would have pulled the rug out from under the US Army and from under the project to build nuclear weapons. For people who know the history of medicine and science in this country, the Kettering Laboratory was at one time one of the largest private laboratories dealing with issues of toxicity. It was a very well-funded laboratory, and its director, Robert Kehoe, was a very senior figure in the public health establishment. Today, we know Kehoe's name best for his career-long defense of the safety of adding lead to gasoline. Kehoe spent a professional lifetime from his pulpit at the Kettering Laboratory assuring the nation that lead added to gasoline was entirely safe. Of course, that's been thoroughly discredited. The toll of health injuries, of neurological injuries to children alone from adding lead to gasoline is almost incalculable, and You know, for that, we really can thank Dr. Robert Kehoe. He soldiered on lead's behalf for his professional lifetime, and he did so being paid by the Ethyl Corporation, who were the makers of tetraethyl lead. The same job that Robert Kehoe did laundering lead's image on industry's behalf, he did for fluoride. Kehoe, along with Harold Hodge, was a leading defender of fluoride safety in the workplace, and he also was a leading promoter of water fluoridation.
Robert Kehoe and the Kettering Institute, on behalf of industry and the National Institute of Dental Research, compiled an extensive bibliography of abstracts on fluoride's toxicity and the role of fluoride in public health. This work was funded by Alcoa, the Aluminum Company of Canada, the American Petroleum Institute, DuPont, Kaiser Aluminum, Reynolds Metals, United Steel, and many other corporate sponsors, as well as the National Institute of Dental Research.
If you go into the files of Dr. Robert Kehoe at the Kettering Laboratory, you'll come across the existence of a hitherto unknown entity known as the Fluorine Lawyers Committee. And Kehoe worked for the Fluorine Lawyers Committee at the University of Cincinnati, doing their bidding, providing ammunition to the Fluorine Lawyers Committee so that they could defend their corporate clients, Alcoa, DuPont, Monsanto, the U.S. Steel, against fluoride lawsuits. In Robert Kehoe's files, there is a medical study which was a state-of-the-art $100,000 study in which beagle dogs were given fluoride to breathe in conditions which approximated the working conditions for men and women in the aluminum industry or in any fluoride industry.
What happened to that beagle study?
The beagle study, Paul, found that fluoride was profoundly toxic to the laboratory animals. The beagle dogs who breathed fluoride 6 days a week, just like workers, had stupendous lung damage and damage to their lymph nodes. You'd think that someone would have given that medical information to America's doctors or to the workers who were going to those doctors asking why they had emphysema. No, the study was given to the Fluorine Lawyers Committee and it was buried. The book makes clear for the first time that the selling of fluoride to the American public was done by the best in the business, by the father of public relations, Edward Bernays. Edward Bernays is Sigmund Freud's nephew, and he was a Machiavellian genius, small in size, yet cast a towering shadow over the 20th century. Bernays understood that there was a liberal sentiment coursing through the 20th century, and that if you could hitch your commercial wagon to that star, then you could make your clients a lot of money. In 1960, had suffragettes march in the Easter parade in New York City holding cigarettes as torches of liberty. And he cooked up that scheme on behalf of the American Tobacco Company and its director, George Hill, who was paying Bernays's salary. Well, my book uncovers correspondence between Bernays and the National Institutes of Dental Research. Bernays was asked to come to Washington by the NIDR to help create their PR campaign to sell fluoride to the nation. Bernays understood that people have an unconscious trust in their doctor or their dentist, and if you can persuade doctors and dentists that fluoride is safe and good, then you're able to reach the rest of the nation. People believe they're doctors and dentists, and that was a way of promoting fluoride for Bernays. Very few dentists are aware that the fluoride in public water supplies is not a pharmaceutical grade product. It is in fact an industrial waste. It's the waste from the Florida phosphate industry. In the 1950s, the Florida phosphate industry was being sued by farmers and citizens living near those plants because of the fluoride. It was killing their cattle, destroying their crops. You know, the Florida phosphate industry today is prevented from having to dispose of its industrial effluent in a toxic waste dump by the device of shipping that in tanker trucks around the country and dumping it in our water supply. From the beginning, opposition to fluoride has been equated with believing the earth is flat or being against the United Nations. Opposition to fluoride is equated with quackery or paranoia, and in fact that's really a media smear. In 1950, the public health endorsed water fluoridation. Almost immediately there was a national movement against fluoride, and that was led by Dr. George Wolbott. We should all know George Wolbott's name. He was the first physician to warn of the dangers of fatal allergic reaction to penicillin. Wolbott was one of the first physicians to warn of the dangers of emphysema from smoking. He saw in his own surgery, in his practice in Detroit, Michigan, that people were coming in with these ailments, unexplained ailments, whether it was back pain or gastric distress, muscle fatigue, headaches, and he figured out that it was low-dose fluoride. That, as with a lot of drugs or chemicals, there's a small subset of people who are uniquely allergic to the chemical, and Wolbott realized that it was fluoride, and he performed a whole series of double-blind experiments where people were given some fluoridated water without knowing it, and the symptoms recurred. And very quickly, Wolbott's name, rather than being seen as this giant of public health committed to safeguarding public health, somebody who would warn us about penicillin or tobacco, suddenly George Wolbott becomes this marginal fringe figure who is criticized for his opposition to fluoride, and that's something that takes place again and again and again. Speaking out as a doctor or a dentist against fluoride is the third rail. It's fatal to your career. We don't know George Wolbott's name because he was smeared by the Public Health Service for his opposition to fluoride. In the 1990s, the senior toxicologist for the EPA's Office of Water said that the cancer tests that had been done on fluoride, where laboratory animals were given fluoride, he said that those results had been gerrymandered, that in fact the equivocal verdict that fluoride was a carcinogen ought to have been much stronger. He said that fluoride given to rats had produced bone cancer and liver cancer, and that those results had been doctored to make it look as though fluoride hadn't caused as much cancer.
I've been in the toxicology business looking at studies of this nature for nearly 25 years, and I've never seen that. Never ever seen where every single endpoint that was a cancer endpoint had been downgraded. I'd seen one or two endpoints argued over, usually on a definition of what is a cancer in that particular tissue, but I've never seen every one of them downgraded. I found that very suspicious.
Marcus was fired. Dr. William Marcus was fired, and a federal judge ruled that Marcus was fired because of his outspoken opposition to fluoride. The first two chapters of the book relate the story of Dr. Phyllis Mullenix at the Forsyth Dental Institute. She had helped invent a new technology for studying the neurotoxicity of chemicals. It was called the computer pattern recognition system, and in essence, Dr. Mullenix's technology took photographs or video of animals which had been given a chemical in small doses, and then used computers to analyze the patterned behavior or the disruptions to patterned behavior when the animals had been given that chemical. While Mullenix was brought into the Forsyth Dental Research Center to study some of the chemicals used in dentistry, and she was asked to study fluoride. And Phyllis Malenik said, I'm not wasting my time with fluoride. Fluoride's given to children, it's good for children, it's been around for donkey's years. I'm wasting my time by studying fluoride. But she did as she was ordered. And Phyllis Malenik found that fluoride in very modest doses produces effects in laboratory animals resembling attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder.
The pattern that we saw, it typically is what we see with other neurotoxic agents that are well known to cause a hypoactivity or a memory problem or an IQ problem. When I first presented the results of these studies, one of the individuals sitting and listening to the results, he says, do you have any idea what you're saying? And he says, you're telling us that we're reducing the IQ of children. And basically I said, yes.
She went from being an industry-funded, leading neurotoxicologist at a Harvard-affiliated research institute to being a voice in the wilderness. She has not received any grants nor any academic position as a research scientist since her opposition to fluoride was made public.
The Center of Disease Control says that water fluoridation is one of the top 10 public health achievements of the 20th century. How can citizens deal with something like that?
Question authority. You know, for years and years and years and years, the public health establishment told us that lead in gasoline was safe. We know today that children's brains were damaged, were injured by the addition of lead to gasoline. You know, the implications of this new documentary evidence, the implications of these buried medical studies, which are now in the public domain as a result of my book, as a result of you know, the medical work that's been done by people like Phyllis Malenik, the willingness to speak truth of toxicologists like William Marcus. The implications of that research, of these new findings, is that something is terribly, terribly wrong, and we have been led very far astray, and it's time to change. But that change will only come as a result of bravery, as a result of the willingness to invest time. You know, I think it's time to speak up, to speak loudly, to get organized, and to fight for change.